This might sound a little strange, but bear with me. Every winter, my friends Josh and Ethan and I have this small tradition: we take a nighttime walk up a hill just outside of town. It's nothing elaborate, just a way to disconnect from everything. There's something special about the silence of a winter night, the muffled crunch of snow under your boots, and the view of the starry sky. It's one of those simple moments that makes us feel alive. It might sound odd, but we never get tired of that sense of complete peace. This happened last January. It was one of those nights where the cold bites at your face, but the snow reflected so much light it almost felt like daytime, even though it was the middle of the night. That evening, it was snowing lightly, and we decided to hike up the hill to enjoy the view. Ethan grabbed his old backpack, the one he usually keeps a thermos of hot chocolate in, and off we went. Josh drove because he had the only car that could handle the steep, winding road up to the trailhead. When we arrived, we parked by a small path leading up the hill. The hill is surrounded by thick woods, and to reach the top, you have to hike for about half an hour. It's a quiet spot, and we never run into anyone there. That night was no different. It was just the three of us and the snowy landscape. As we hiked, we chatted about random stuff, laughing at the usual nonsense. About halfway up, Ethan turned on a flashlight because the trees blocked out the moonlight. Everything seemed normal until we noticed something strange off to the side of the trail. There was a set of tracks, large and deep, leading into the woods. They didn't look like animal tracks, they were too regular, too human. Josh joked that maybe they belonged to a hiker. But who in their right mind would be out here at night in this cold? We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It felt like we were being watched. When we reached the top, we stopped to drink some hot chocolate and take a few pictures. The view was stunning, but the atmosphere felt off. The silence was too heavy, almost oppressive. Even Josh and Ethan seemed to sense it, because they stopped talking too. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a noise coming from the woods. It was a strange sound, a mix between a groan and a growl. We all turned toward the direction it was coming from and saw something moving between the trees. It was a tall, hunched figure slowly making its way toward us. Ethan immediately turned off the flashlight, and we stood frozen. At first, we thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer, but then we noticed its movements were too strange. It kept stopping every few steps, as if it were searching for something. And then we saw it was dragging something behind it. As the figure got closer, we could make out more details. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. They were wearing a long, dark coat and carrying what looked like a sack over their shoulder. We ducked behind a tree, holding our breath. Josh whispered, "What is he doing?" but none of us answered. The person stopped in the middle of the clearing, where the snow was more compact, and started digging with a shovel. It looked like they were trying to bury something. We kept watching in silence, trying not to make any noise, but my heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. At one point, the person stopped digging and pulled something out of the sack, but it was too far away for us to make out what it was. And then, Josh accidentally stepped on a dry branch. The crack was deafening in the stillness of the night. The figure immediately turned toward us, staring in our direction. Even though we were hidden among the trees, I had the overwhelming feeling that they'd seen us. Without saying a word, we started backing away slowly, but then the figure shouted something. We couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to make us panic. We bolted. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming out in short, white puffs in the freezing air. I didn't even look back to see if they were following us. We reached the car, threw ourselves inside, and Josh started the engine. We sped off down the hill without even bothering to buckle our seatbelts. None of us said a word, we were too shaken. I don't know who that person was or what they were doing, but I can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes I wonder if we saw something we weren't supposed to see. My grandfather has done numerous maintenance works over the years. The house is still ours, but it is now reaching the end of its useful life. My grandfather often talks about wanting to tear it down and build a new one, but I don't interfere in his decisions. The story I am about to tell took place about 15 years ago when I was 6 years old, and my cousin Emily was 9. We were in Wyoming during a snowstorm. The snowfall was so intense that we couldn't stay inside. The amazing thing about going there as kids was the vastness of the space. The property is enormous, surrounded by woods in every direction. There is a dead-end road that winds downhill and leads to other equally large properties. It's the perfect place to play outdoors, and that's exactly what we were doing. My cousin Emily and I decided to have a sledding race. Each of us had to build our own path in the snow, without any help. In the end, we would compete to see who could sled down the fastest, starting from a hill that seemed never-ending. After making several runs, we eventually challenged each other to build the highest jump, and then take another giant snowball and throw it as far as possible to see who could land it the farthest. Emily decided to build her base on the neighboring property. That place was almost always empty, as it was 9 times out of 10 whenever we were there. So, we often played on the neighbor's land too. Since they were never around, what we would do was build a sledding path in the snow without any help. Sometimes, we would also challenge each other to see who could make the fastest descent, starting from a hill that seemed endless. Once Emily slid down the road and disappeared, I had to wait for her to blow the whistle to signal the start of the game. I waited for a while, quite a long time, over 5 minutes. By then, she had likely already built her path, so all that was left for her was to come back down and blow the whistle, which she did around the 10th minute. At that point, I thought I might not hear the whistle from where I was, so I started planning my path. Should I cut through the woods or go down the road? I opted for the road because, honestly, cutting through the woods during a snowstorm at 6 years old seemed like a frightening idea. I began walking through the uncleared snow, with the flakes hitting my face. Despite all the jackets my mom had made me wear, I wasn't cold. When I approached the driveway of the neighboring property, I looked through the trees but didn't see Emily anywhere. With all the branches and bare winter trees, it was quite easy to see through the woods, so I decided to enter the property through the trees, trying to stay unnoticed. But Emily was nowhere to be found. I saw her path in the snow, so I looked around, and when I realized there was no sign of her, I approached her base to take the treasure. Before I could, I heard a woman's voice calling out, "Excuse me, are you looking for your cousin?" I turned toward the direction of the voice, and it was an elderly woman standing at the door of the neighbor's house. I replied that we were playing a game. She said, "Your cousin is inside." I was very confused. I started walking toward the steps of the house, and as I got closer, the woman's face became clearer in my 6-year-old mind. She looked much older than she probably was. As I approached the house, I noticed someone at one of the upstairs windows looking at me for a second. I thought it was Emily. It was someone with half their face covered, presumably by a black cap, and the lower half of their face hidden by the edge of the window. I also noticed another set of footprints in the snow leading to the front door. They had to be Emily's. The woman gave me an incredibly unsettling smile. I remember the feeling of my heart sinking for some reason. She gestured for me to come inside to warm up from the cold. I froze and shouted, "Emily," but there was no response. The woman stopped smiling. She hadn't expected me to do that. I also noticed that the other set of footprints doubled back. If they had been Emily's, the prints would have turned and gone back toward the woods. Then I heard heavy footsteps coming from inside the house. They sounded like they were coming from upstairs and heading down. I started to run. The woman yelled something, either to me or to someone else, but I didn't understand. I turned back once to look at the house, and the face that had been at the upstairs window was gone. I ran off the property, back onto the road, retracing the footprints I had left earlier. I began to hear my grandfather's whistle coming from the hill, the whistle he used to call me and Emily home for dinner. When I reached our driveway, my grandfather and Emily were already there. They had come looking for me before I could even explain what had just happened. Emily was already telling them that there were people in the neighbor's house inviting her to come inside. I said the same thing had happened to me. So, my grandfather went down there with something in his hand, possibly a weapon, while we waited at home with my grandmother. He returned after a while and said the front door was locked and no one answered. Then we went to another neighbor's house, someone who knew the owners of the house, and they called them. This part still makes me shiver every time my grandfather mentions what they told him. The owners of that house weren't there that weekend. No one was supposed to be in that house. The police were called and everything, and Emily and I had to speak with one of the officers to describe the woman. After that, according to my grandfather, we were no longer involved, although the back door was found unlocked, and the house was inspected, but nothing was found. Because of this, my grandparents took all the extra valuables away for fear of another break-in. And after that day, while we were still there, we avoided playing on that property, mostly because of how creepy that memory was. Thank God we didn't go into that house. I learned to ski almost at the same time I learned to walk. My parents were mountain enthusiasts, and they actually met during a winter hike. For them, it was important that my siblings and I learned to move on snow from a very young age. Now I'm 21, and this story dates back a few winters ago, when I was in my last year of university. Living in the northeastern United States, there's no better place to ski than Maine. That trip was supposed to be just an ordinary getaway, one of those we organize with friends to take a break from routine. I was with my best friends, Alex, Carter, and Logan. I don't remember exactly which mountain we were exploring, because Alex had planned everything, and Carter had taken care of transportation. What I do know is that the place was enormous, with dozens of trails and countless chairlifts. If I had to guess, I'd say we were at Sugarloaf, but I'm not entirely sure. We skied for 2 consecutive days, and I'm sure we didn't even see all the trails, it was that vast. The second day was dedicated to pure fun, no maps, no hesitation, just fast descents and friendly competitions. As was tradition, we had a small bottle of whiskey with us to warm up a bit and make everything more lighthearted. The black trails always pushed us to our limits, and every run turned into a race to see who was the fastest or most daring. By late afternoon, the day was drawing to a close. We were sitting at the top of a chairlift, trying to decide how to make the most of the last hour on the slopes, when we noticed 2 girls approaching us. I can't stress this enough, they were incredibly charming, the kind of people who make you wonder what they're doing there. One had brown hair tied back in a long ponytail, and the other was blonde, with a smile you couldn't ignore. They introduced themselves as Maddie and Brooke and, without much preamble, started chatting with us. They explained that they were bored because there weren't many young people around. A detail we had also noticed. It was clear they were looking for company, and we certainly weren't going to say no. Brooke seemed like an experienced skier. She kept asking Carter technical questions about his racing skis, which always flustered him a bit since he's quite reserved. Maddie, on the other hand, was more direct and witty, cracking jokes about our whiskey, which she claimed was too basic. Out of nowhere, she pulled out a silver flask and challenged us to try it. We didn't even know what that liquor was, but Logan, who never turns down a challenge, accepted without a second thought. I was more cautious because something about the situation made me a bit uneasy. It all seemed too perfect to be true. Despite my doubts, the conversation flowed pleasantly. Brooke seemed particularly taken with Logan's enthusiasm, while Maddie stuck close to Alex. I thought we'd spend the rest of the day skiing with them, but then Maddie mentioned a trail called Shadow Woods. None of us had ever heard of it, and it wasn't marked on the map we had. They explained that it was a hidden path through the trees, rarely open to the public because it was considered too dangerous. Always on the lookout for adventure and challenges, we couldn't resist such a proposal. So, we decided to follow them. We skied to a point where there was no one else around, and the girls guided us to a barely visible trail. At one point, we had to take off our skis and hike uphill for a stretch, crossing an area of untouched snow. It felt like we were in another world, far from the hustle and bustle of the main trails. The mountain was silent, and all around us were tall trees and crisp air that smelled of adventure. The idea of an adventure excited us, and partly out of curiosity, partly due to the alcohol we had drunk, we unhooked our skis and started following the girls up the mountain. Logan and Alex moved ahead, probably hoping to impress Maddie and Brooke, while Carter and I hung back, carefully observing the trail. I noticed that Carter had a tense, almost worried expression, so I asked him what was on his mind. He and I were always the most rational ones in the group. Logan, on the other hand, was always ready to throw himself into anything without a second thought, and Alex tended to follow along without asking too many questions. Carter told me he found it strange that this trail was so hard to reach. I agreed with him. In all my years of skiing, I had never encountered a trail that required hiking uphill without skis just to reach the descent. We exchanged a knowing glance and decided to stay alert, but we didn't worry too much. After all, what could two girls possibly do to a group like ours? When we finally reached a flatter area surrounded by trees, Carter and I caught up with the others. Logan was laughing hysterically with Maddie, while Alex seemed completely captivated by Brooke. The girls showed us a hidden trail between the trees, a steep slope leading into the woods. I glanced at Carter, who raised an eyebrow, clearly still skeptical. When Brooke told us that this trail led directly to the chairlifts, something didn't quite sit right with me. "Shouldn't it be on the map?" Carter asked. Maddie laughed and replied that it was a special, unofficial trail that only the most experienced skiers knew about. Before we could respond, Brooke pulled out the silver flask again and told us we needed to toast before we started. Logan and Alex, without a second thought, each took a long sip. When it was my turn, I raised the flask to my lips but didn't actually drink. Something still felt off, especially since I had noticed that the girls hadn't taken a single sip of alcohol the entire time. Carter politely declined, saying he was already feeling buzzed, and for a split second, I thought I saw Brooke's expression darken. It was just for a moment, because she immediately put her carefree smile back on, but that brief look made me even more uneasy. A few minutes later, Maddie urged us, "We're wasting time, follow us." Before we could say anything, the two girls launched themselves down the slope. Logan and Alex, of course, immediately followed them, shouting and laughing like kids. Carter and I exchanged another glance. "Let's go," he said with a sigh, and we started skiing down. The trail was narrow, winding, and full of trees, not exactly suited for inexperienced skiers, but that wasn't an issue for us. However, as we descended, I noticed there were no other ski tracks, no signs that anyone had been there recently. At the bottom of the slope, we found a small clearing in the forest, completely isolated. The others were already there, laughing and flirting as if nothing was wrong. But as I looked around, I saw no chairlifts, no other trails leading anywhere else. Just trees, snow, and silence. "Where are the chairlifts?" I asked, my tone more serious now. Maddie casually replied that they were nearby and that they'd take us there soon. I tried to relax, but something still didn't feel right. Just then, Logan, who had been laughing and joking, suddenly stopped. He wavered for a moment, then collapsed backward, completely unconscious. For a second, I thought he was joking, but when he didn't get up, panic began to set in. Brooke laughed nervously. Maybe he drank a little too much. But when Alex also collapsed a few seconds later, I realized the situation was serious. I rushed over to them, removing my skis. Both of them were breathing, but they were completely unresponsive. What the hell is going on?" Carter shouted, turning to the girls. Maddie raised her hands, pretending to be surprised. "We have no idea. It's not our fault." But there was something in her tone that sent a chill down my spine. Carter stepped closer, glaring at them, but he didn't even have time to say anything else. He collapsed in the snow, unconscious as well. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Brooke and Maddie looked at me with smiles that now seemed anything but innocent. I realized I had never felt so alone and vulnerable in my entire life. I stood frozen, paralyzed by both fear and the effect of whatever substance was coursing through my body. I couldn't believe that a simple skiing trip had turned into such a bizarre and horrifying situation. The girls no longer pretended, they looked at me with cold, almost bored expressions, as if they were waiting for me to collapse like the others. I felt weak, but my mind was still sharp. Slowly, I sank to the snow, trying to buy some time. "What the hell did you do to us?" I shouted, my voice breaking with fear and anger. Neither of them answered. Maddie turned to Brooke and whispered something I couldn't hear, but her tone betrayed impatience. Brooke muttered a curse under her breath, then turned to me and replied coldly, "You didn't drink enough, that's why." My heart was pounding, and with each passing second, I fought to stay focused. Maddie and Brooke began arguing quietly, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then, as if they had reached a decision, they turned toward my friend's skis and started unfastening them. I had no idea why they were taking the skis, but my instinct screamed that it wasn't a good sign. I watched as they lifted Alex's and Logan's skis, carrying them on their shoulders with surprising ease, and began walking toward the forest without even glancing in my direction. My mind was racing, I had to stop them, but my body was still under the influence of whatever they had given us. I made a desperate attempt to stand, but I immediately collapsed back into the snow. After a few minutes, I felt the numbness start to fade, at least partially. I managed to get to my feet with great difficulty, staggering, and decided to follow their tracks in the snow. I couldn't just let them leave. The tracks were clearly visible, but they were surprisingly far ahead of me, despite carrying 2 pairs of skis each. I quickened my pace, trying not to lose my strength. Eventually, the forest opened up into a clearing, and I found myself on a snow-covered road. It was clear we were on the other side of the mountain. That's when I saw a van parked not far away, its headlights off. I hid behind a tree, my breathing shallow. Maddie and Brooke reached the vehicle, and the door swung open. 3 burly men got out and began talking to them. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their gestures sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, one of the men turned and looked straight in my direction. I froze. I thought I was hidden, but clearly, they had noticed something. The man pointed toward me and said something to the others. I didn't wait to find out their intentions. I turned and started running back, following the tracks I had left in the snow. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and regret. I had left my friends alone, vulnerable, not knowing what might happen to them. When I finally reached them, Alex and Logan were still unconscious. I dropped to my knees next to Carter, shaking him with all the strength I had. After several attempts and a few handfuls of snow to his face, he began to stir. "What's going on?" he mumbled, still groggy. I told him everything, speaking so quickly I could barely breathe. Carter, still weak, tried to stand but immediately collapsed back into the snow. Together, we attempted to wake Alex and Logan, but it was no use. They were completely unresponsive. In the meantime, I kept nervously glancing back toward the direction I had come, fearing that the men from the van might be following us. Thankfully, they didn't, but every crack of a branch in the forest made me jump. We waited for what felt like an eternity before Alex and Logan finally began to regain consciousness. When they woke up, confused and scared, we told them everything that had happened. They couldn't believe our story, but the weakness and dizziness they felt convinced them that we weren't exaggerating. The journey back to the car was pure agony. Every step felt like an eternity, and the thought that those people might reappear weighed heavily on us. When we finally reached the parking lot, we discovered that the mountain staff had already left for the day. We reported everything to the police, but their skeptical expressions made it clear we probably wouldn't get any answers. The tracks from the van were already covered by snow, and our descriptions of the girls and the men were too vague. It took us days to fully recover, but the fear and the questions lingered. Who were those people? Why did they do it? Was it a robbery, or was there something more sinister behind it? Even now, we don't have answers. Maybe we never will. But one thing is certain: since that day, every time I go skiing, I make sure never to stray from the official trails again.